So today I wanted to talk a little bit about AzBats, or a period of time during which Bruce Wayne was not Batman. This actually happened in the early 1990s, and essentially, long story short, Bruce Wayne battled Bane as Batman, and obviously a lot of people are now familiar with Bane as a character from the Batman Begins era of Batman films. But of course he had his start in comics, as most of the Batman on-screen villains do. And in this particular circumstance, it was a similar storyline in the sense that Batman had been thrown up against a lot of enemies who had been released by Bane to weaken Batman. So that when the time came, Batman faced off with Bane, but he was crippled. So as a result, although he wasn't killed, because Bane wanted him to see his victory, basically, and see him sort of take over Gotham, as a result, Bruce Wayne had to substitute somebody for the role of the Bat. Somebody else had to take up the mantle of the Bat. And rather than it be Robin, he chose a guy called Jean-Paul Valley. And Jean-Paul Valley had quite a dark history, and it turned out to be an error on Bruce Wayne's part, because he took the mantle of the Bat and he made it tarnished. He soaked it in blood, as Bruce Wayne put it himself, when he met up with him once he'd actually sort of got the ability to walk back, because he was properly crippled, so it took him quite a while to come back. And interestingly, there's a character called Lady Shiva in the comics, who I don't think we've ever seen on screen, but she's actually quite critical in this storyline in the comics in terms of bringing Bruce Wayne back to a fighting Batman standard, basically, because he has to relearn his skills because his muscles have grown soft from being in the wheelchair. So that in and of itself is an interesting part of the storyline. But the idea of this video is to partly take you through the storyline, but also to show you some of the merchandise that came off the back of this particular storyline, because I've always loved the version of the Batman suit that came about as a result of Jean-Paul Valley taking over the mantle of the Bat. And it's only very recently that I've actually discovered that there were action figures based off this particular storyline. Even though it was sort of, early 90s, it wasn't until 2000s, I believe, that we first got anything off the back of it. So we're going to start with this chap. Now this is Azrael. This was an Eagle Moss figurine, incidentally. I picked this up quite recently, quite randomly, but this is the precursor to the Jean-Paul Valley version of Batman, basically, because this is he's an assassin, but he's assassin in the employ of an organisation called St. Dumas. And the Order of St. Dumas have programmed him and implanted him from childhood with a sort of hypnotic suggestion type conditioning called the system. And the system allows him to build stuff and fight and not really know where it's coming from. He just sort of does it automatically. So as you can see, he is somewhat armoured. He uses blades that can be ignited so that they can, basically shoot flame, and the blades themselves can shoot out. And with these tools, he sets out to eliminate the enemies of the Order of St. Dumas. So the problem that then occurs with Jean-Paul Valley as Batman is that the system starts to distort his perception of reality. And this is a bad thing when it comes to him performing as Batman. So he was introduced in this comic book, which was The Sword of Azrael. And this was a sort of, it led not sort of indirectly into what became known as the Knightfall series. So in this book, Azrael takes over the mantle of Azrael. Prior to that, he'd just been a student. Jean-Paul Valley had just been a normal student. But his father had been conditioning him, and his father gets killed whilst on a mission for St. Dumas. and he is then activated and becomes Azrael, and he redesigns the suit. So it moves away from a sort of a more traditional Avenging Angel type affair to a more armoured affair. And I'll throw some images up from the comics as I go through this. So his story then becomes entwined with Batman's story, because Batman is captured because someone realises who he is, who Bruce Wayne is. And this guy, Lahar, basically takes on the mantle of the Bat in a sort of twisted way and starts killing off his enemies. But Azrael goes after him and succeeds in defeating him, and he rescues Bruce Wayne in the process. And in doing that, he finds out that Bruce Wayne is Batman, because Alfred is also involved in trying to rescue Bruce. So, off the back of all that, we have this connection, and obviously a recognition that he's a very skilled fighter, but he needs more training to sort of hone his skills because he's not been at it very long. But we then have this ongoing storyline with Batman versus Bane, which is this Knightfall Part 1. I think it's been collected differently, but this is my very, very old, well-thumbed version of it. And most of this book is taken up by Bruce Wayne as Batman fighting villains like the Scarecrow over a period of time and becoming increasingly physically debilitated. I think at one point he was actually on the same venom that Bane uses to make himself pumped up. And he actually he had to bring himself off that, but as a result that weakened him. So the net effect of that is that, as I say, he gets his back broken by Bane, and so is temporarily crippled. And the sort of suit that he's wearing at the time is basically this, and I've had this for donkey's years. I'm not even sure who produced it, but I've always quite liked this because it reminds me of the 60s Batman, and I always quite liked his suit because it's just very simple. There's no sort of heavy armour on it. I do wonder though whether it's canon that his bat symbol on his chest is always an armour plate, because in The Dark Knight Returns, it's established that he wears that on his chest on purpose because it gives the Crook something to shoot at, and he armours that part of himself only because he can't armour anything else effectively and still retain his mobility. So that becomes relevant to this storyline as we go on. So we're at this sort of era of Batman at the time when he's defeated by Bane. So off the back of that, we then come to Knightfall Part 2. And as you can see, this Batman is rather different. This is not the traditional Batman who we are used to seeing. This is a more armoured Batman, because Jean-Paul Valley begins by just taking on the normal bat suit, but the system is basically telling him you need more than this. So over the course of several issues, what we see is that he develops a version of the bat suit which has metal gauntlets, and they're quite nasty gauntlets. They have sort of metal claws on the end of them, and they shoot shurikens. So it's not batarangs anymore, it's shurikens shaped like batarangs, basically. And that also includes the grapple as well. And to me, that made a lot of sense, because it means that he's always got it to hand, quite literally, rather than having to sort of take it off his utility belt and shoot it as a separate tool, which can be lost, of course, as you see quite frequently. So he ends up with these gloves that can shoot shurikens, so he's actually got a properly sort of ranged weapon for the first time. And that's the first time we've ever really seen him use any sort of armoured technology. Well, it's the first time I've seen him have that as a concept. So by the end of Knightfall Part 2, he's taken the suit a step further. And I'll throw this up, but it was one of the things I really remembered about this issue of the comic. It was 500, but it was this image I really liked. I'll show you some others, but this one is the one I particularly remember. It's just the idea that he's basically turned the cape into something that can glide, because in a previous encounter with Bane, he finds that the cape actually slows him down in the air, and he wants it to do the opposite. But he also takes that opportunity to then add further things to the bat suit. So he adds in a more sort of enclosed cowl and a light on the top of the chest, which you can use to sort of dazzle and to display the bat signal, and a few more sort of utility belts add-ons as well. And that version is then what you get with this DC Multiverse figure. And I picked this up from Cosmic Toys recently. It's shown it on a previous video, but I haven't got it out, so I think I'll quite want to leave it in. It's a McFarlane Toys figure, DC Multiverse. You can see there on the back that is the first sort of AzBats version of the armor, and he's starting to look more like Azrael now. But it's called, I refer to it as the AzBats armor because that's how this version of Batman came to be known. But interestingly, it says that this is the Azrael Batman armor. And I have been told that there was a comic that followed up the Batman animated series in which Azrael wore this armor. But you'll notice it doesn't have a bat symbol on it, on the actual armor itself here. There's nothing on the chest. And that does change later. But this is pretty much spot on to the version that I just showed you in the comic. So it's got the enclosed cowl, it's got the gauntlet, it's got this utility belt on his leg, which it gets dropped later, but it's only at this point in time he's actually got that as an add-on. So although I haven't got it out, I can see it's a very accurate representation of that particular version of Jean-Paul Valley's armour, which is what drew me to it, obviously, because this is the one I've been looking for and I've been aware of. What I didn't know about was some of the later ones, which I'm going to show you. So I got this huge compendium, which is called Night Quest. So this is part of the Knightfall Saga. But this is what happens as Jean-Paul Valley is developing into his role as the Batman. And he goes increasingly off the rails, basically. And as he goes off the rails, the Batman armor that he's designed shifts, and the system calls upon him to redevelop it and change it and improve it over time. So what we end up with is a different head on it initially. So the first change that he makes is that he gets more of a sort of a heads-up sensor, he gets a heads-up display, but then he decides that he's going to upgrade his shuriken launcher as well. So his shuriken launcher gets nastier, and it gets a sort of a back-fed reservoir of shurikens, and basically he just goes darker and darker. And he also adds a flamethrower to his right gauntlet as well as the shuriken launcher. So ultimately this leads to him actually killing someone or allowing someone to be killed when he could have prevented it, and that Bruce Wayne sees as a sort of the last straw, basically, because that isn't what the Batman is all about. The Batman should be protecting people as much as he fights crime. So you can see there, that's an example of his sort of slightly adjusted armour. So it's not dissimilar to his initial Batman 500 armour, but it does get increasingly nasty until finally the system provokes him basically into upgrading it a final time, which he describes that as being his sort of ultimate Batman armour. So you can see there that on the cover of this issue, he's finally got this sort of shuriken feed that goes into his right gauntlet, and he can do the flamethrower bit. So it's pretty nasty at that point. He looks almost robotic at that point. Probably partly what appealed to me. So he's not quite Iron Man because he's not kind of fully encased in armor, but it made a lot of sense to me because I thought, if people are shooting kind of automatic weapons at you, then the odds are a bullet is going to catch you. So surely you'd want some basic level of bulletproofness to try and help you keep going. Because if there's only one of you, in fact, it even made sense to me that there'd be a backup Batman. Because, surely he's got to have some downtime at some point. That was kind of my thinking. I thought, yeah, fair dues. I completely get that as a concept. At this point in time, along with that upgrade, he also changes the cape, so it stops being a cape and actually becomes kind of metal fins. So even the cape itself is armored. So you can see there, it looks a lot spikier than it used to, and that's why. It's because it's actually separate sheets of metal. So what we end up with is this guy. Now, this is a DC Universe Classics figure. I think that's right. And it's not dissimilar to the McFarlane figure, as you can see. I don't have a box for this one, but it's almost spot on, except that I would argue that this doesn't exist in the comics. So he doesn't seem to have in the comics a feed that goes for the shurikens that goes into his left arm. So I'm not quite sure whether that one just has a sort of a reservoir of its own or what. But in the comics, he doesn't seem to have a left feeder mechanism. But it's got the black bat symbol on it, which is in the comics. It's got the fins, which are, as I've just been mentioning, are definitely in the comics in the later version. It's got this little sensor on the helmet, which is exactly the same as in the comics. It's got this little section in the back, the reservoir, which is as it is in the comics. So, and you'll notice that the leg utility belt is gone as well. So this is a really, really good reproduction of what's in the comics. It's very, very impressive. But this isn't where it stops, because this is the final form of Jean-Paul's armour, the AzBats armour, before Bruce Wayne comes back to take the mantle of the Bat back from him by force, if necessary. But in the process of that conflict, Azrael uses his flamethrower on Batman, but unfortunately it backfires, almost literally, not just metaphorically, and he catches light, so he's engulfed in flame. Now, his suit being his suit is designed to resist flame, but it alters his paint job rather significantly. And in that issue, we see that where his wings have been hit, there are actually patches of red. So what we end up with is this version of him. And this is Night's End. So this is the final compilation that I had where Batman, as Bruce Wayne, finally confronts Jean-Paul Valley. And Jean-Paul Valley's armour transforms into this final form, which is red and gold. And of course you will recognise that as being very, very similar to his Azrael armour. So this is the final form, rather nice red and gold version of his armour. And as you can see, that is not a million miles away from the sort of styling that he had when he was Azrael. So ultimately the system really does corrupt him and his vision for the Batman legacy, because in effect it becomes a St. Dumas legacy, and that's the problem. And that is why Bruce Wayne has to come back, and he does. But he realises very cleverly that basically John Paul's suit does give him a lot of advantages. So he finds a way to get him back into the Batcave, and then out of the Batcave through a passageway which requires him to lose his armour, because he realises that if they're physically equal, he's got more options. But at the same time, he also recognises that Jean-Paul is very, very fragile mentally, and so he doesn't want to completely crush him as an individual. So he finds a way to sort of bring him back without actually, destroying the man. So it's a nice finish to that series. I mean, there were God knows how many issues between sort of Knightfall, Night Quest, Night's End, over lots of different issues of Batman. I jump in and out of Batman. I tend to get Batman as collected issues. I don't get individual issues of the series. But at this point in time, this was one I just really enjoyed the overall arc of. So that's why I have so many of the graphic novels of this particular one. Although I've only gotten this Night Quest one quite recently. I may even still be missing some issues, I think. I'm not even sure if I've really properly sat and read all of this yet. Because it is so thick. I mean, when you compare it to, it's at least twice the size of the previous ones I was looking at. I mean, the one thing about this exercise that does make me smile. The interesting thing is I haven't found yet a record of this version of him in the DC Universe Classics information that I've seen. So I'm going to have to do a little bit more digging. But you can see he is basically a straight up repaint. It's a classic way of getting more life out of one mould, I think it's fair to say, because the articulation is identical. There's a lot of articulation as well, actually. I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but his legs are you can sort of twist his legs in all sorts of interesting ways, as well as just at the knees, and he's got ankle articulation as well. So they're really good figures. They're a nice size. In fact, I've got a ruler handy here. Let me just see. I think they were supposed to be 6-inch figures. Yeah, well, in fact, he's taller than that. He's more like 7 inches because of his armor, but because of the wings on the back there. So this, I mean, I would have loved it if Batman had actually kept this sort of armor, or at least the toned down version of it that was originally introduced in issue 500, because I think that would have been a really, really sensible modern upgrade without moving too far away from the traditional Bat costume. Because what we've ended up with these days, it seems, from things that I've seen, I read Night of the Owls. I'm not quite sure how long ago that was now in the actual sort of Batman series, but the armor that he had there, that was just kind of sort of a lot of sort of plating and stuff in various parts of his suit, seems to be the sort of the way they've gone with the modern Batman. I guess that he is now more armoured as a matter of course, and perhaps was previously the case, which again I think makes perfect sense. The other thing I wanted to mention was that this also reminded me of the sort of powered armour that we see Batman use when he's going up against Superman, and that concept came about a lot earlier, I think, than this series, because in The Dark Knight Returns, we see that approach that Batman uses to actually use powered armor for the first time. I imagine is in that book, because we've seen that again in Batman v Superman, the film, almost frame for frame actually in some places. The Dark Knight Returns, the comic, is reproduced in that film in many respects, but this, I think, was a more sort of like a day-to-day version of that, if you like. But I think that the idea at the heart of the comic is that ultimately he's a detective and a sort of martial artist first, rather than being some sort of one-man, Punisher type character. So he doesn't need the weaponry, he doesn't need flamethrowers. He relies on his wits. And that's actually a conversation that they have when they're fighting towards the end of the sort of the Night's End run. Is Jean-Paul saying that he's too weak and what does he rely on? And Bruce Wayne says whatever happens to be at hand, which is another way of doing it. But it just goes to show how diametrically opposite they end up being, and it's a great regret for Bruce Wayne that he chose to put Jean-Paul Valley in there, and that he allowed him to go in there as well, because he doesn't really see it as being his fault, because he knows his mind's been twisted. But it is kind of Bruce Wayne's fault for allowing him and trusting him with that responsibility when his mind wasn't right. So I'm very pleased to have these action figures for display, because I've had this chap for donkey's years now, and it's going to be one of my sort of little mini collections, I think, just having these guys to display along with some of the sort of the animated series vehicles and things like that as well. And I've got a fair few Batmobiles elsewhere as well these days. I hope you've enjoyed that. I mean, I do recommend this series if you haven't got it. Some of the artwork is really, really impressive in it as well. Some of it's a little bit less my style, my taste, but you know, it's a very personal thing, that. So I think before I run out of voice, I will leave you there. Do like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one. Cheers for now.